My mother developed Alzheimer's disease. I decided that I was going to be there for my mum, but I used to take her out regularly, and we used to drive in Malvern Hills. Every week we drive in the hills and she'd say, "Do we live here?" And I'd say, "Yes, mum." And she would say, "Aren't we lucky?" And I suddenly realised that I had taken this incredible place for granted. In the 1980s, I was working out in France, restoring wine chateaux, working with French aristocrats on the most incredible designs. And that, I thought, was the summit of my career. The folklore is that if you want a good sleep, you sleep under a weeping willow tree. Then I realised that it's the bark of the willow, it's similar to, or it's an ingredient in aspirin. And if any of your listeners listen to Radio 4, there's a programme by a comedian called Mark Steele. I am the president of Malvern Spa Association. We look after Malvern spring water, basically. We're just the guardians of it. And he mentioned me on Radio 4, so they may have heard of me in that regard.
Welcome everybody to Cafe Rainy Days. Welcome Kali to Cafe Rainy Days.
Hello, Sujata. Thank you so much for having me.
It's so good to have you. And for the benefit of the viewers, this is a topic that is going to cover landscapes, foraging, Malvern Waters, which is a spa area with lots of natural springs and natural water, and much more. And I'm really ignorant about these issues. So we've got the expert with us, Kali Tinkler, who we are so fortunate to have on the channel. I'm going to read my notes now. So Kali Tinkler is a chartered landscape architect and environmental and color consultant with over 40 years of experience. She's worked with several projects on councils, government, historic projects, national parks, and much, much more. In the 1980s, she introduced environmental color assessment, and she's also the president of Malvern Spa Association. Amongst other things, she's also an author. She's authored a book. How I met Kali is we went on this walk, and this walk was, it was opposing a solar farm. Now, one of the things that Kali's CV says is that she works with sustainable projects. So if I can throw the very first question at you, Kali, you're pro-sustainable issues, but then you're opposing a solar farm.
Well, that was the question I asked myself 3 years ago when a group approached me and asked if I would advise them and help them oppose a solar development. And I said, "Oh, I don't think so. Solar is good. It's sustainable. We need renewable, clean energy." And they said, "Well, will you just have a look at the application for us?" So I said, "Yes, okay." And the only reason I said I would take it on was because the quality of the information which had been submitted was so poor. I felt professionally that I didn't want them to get away with that. I was giving them a bit of a ticking off. But as I looked closer at the project, I began to realise that what we have to make clear at the beginning is that there's a big difference between talking about solar generally, which can be fantastic. What I'm talking about specifically is large-scale solar development, ground-mounted in rural areas on farmland. And over time, I came to the conclusion that we are being sold a picture of benign solar panels with sheep and wildflowers underneath. The reality, not only of that, and the environmental destruction that's caused putting these things in and the loss of productive arable land, but the construction can be so devastating that it will actually devastate wildlife, communities, footpaths, water, air quality. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes, it does. So there's so many aspects that you have to look at, isn't it, when you're planning something like this? This actually leads nicely into my next question. So I was reading a bit about you, and one of the sentences that I came across when we talk about your work, it says, "Much of Kali's work is in the neighborhood planning, helping people develop more in-depth understanding of landscape and its values. So how do you go about this?
In fact, it's precisely the picnic that we delightfully met you at was precisely that. So the group that organised it, they commissioned me professionally to help them put in their response to the solar development that's on the fields that we walked around. But over time, I feel that rather than me just do the job, take the money and go away, people can actually do this for themselves. And as long as they've got expert professional help and guidance, when you're faced with a development that is worrying, it's terrible really for people's health and well-being and the quality of their lives. They're terrified. But the more knowledge they have, the more power they have, and the more control they feel. And these things can last for 3-4 years, the whole process. It's not great for people, but the first thing I do is I give them homework, and I say, right, I want you to tell me what's there. What creatures, what birds, what trees? Oh, well, we don't know anything about trees. We'll go and get a tree identification book. Then they come back and I say to them, well, now what you've found, is that important to you or to who and why? Oh, well, and then I get back, and establishing the value of the landscape is actually a part of the planning decision process, because if we can demonstrate that this landscape has high value, then it's less likely that certain forms of development would be allowed because it needs to be protected through planning policy. People know much more about their own backyards than anybody else, and the developers than me. And sometimes when the groups go out, they're actually discovering things that nobody knew was there, which are nationally important. They find historic things, archaeology, they find protected species. So I just decided I want to help people learn how to do this for themselves. Some of them do go on to do more of the technical work. They become quite interested. And I do try and I have had some successes in members of groups saying that they want to do landscape architecture as a profession.
Oh, wow.
It's really learning how to speak the language of landscape, what's there and why it might be important. And a lot of that is to do with its function. What role is it playing in this landscape? How is it helping what we see? Is it softening? Is it hiding something? What's hiding in there? Is it ancient? Is it modern? And once people have learnt how to do that and they've come out of the other end of the process, regardless of how it went for them, in other words, in terms of a decision went one way or the other, they come out with a sense of having gone through a dreadful process, but having learnt a lot, and therefore it having given them something back in a very odd way.
It's enriching, isn't it? Like you said, the person who is living there will know what is in their backyard, but not really. We don't really know what's in our backyard. I mean, yes, I'm from India, but I can't. I mean, other than the oak, I can't identify any trees in on the walkway behind my house, or a few birds like the robin. Maybe I can identify. But I remember when we came on the walk, the first thing you started with, just look around the horizon, and then we slowly went from there. So what is this wood about, and what sort of trees are there, and then what was there so many years ago, and we went right up to the Ice Age. On the sort of first look, you just see some woods, and you see some agricultural land, and that's it. But you really can dig deeper and get so much more.
Yes, but your response that you've just said to me now is why I do what I do.
Yes.
You obviously enjoyed it enough to have me on.
Yes, of course. Yeah, because it was very insightful and also in a way very embarrassing, that the fact that I just didn't know that much, I've lived here on this land for so many years and I still don't know. And one should try and dig deeper and understand more where you are, and it gives you a good context, isn't it?
Actually, shall I tell you how my journey started? I was very lucky that I was brought up in a very rural environment, and my father absolutely loved nature. So he knew the trees. I mean, at age 2, I was allowed to go into a stream, which was quite away from the house, and so I had this natural affinity with nature. And then I went off and did my professional work and qualified and all the rest of it, and became a professional landscape architect. And it was all about helping the client achieve what they wanted to achieve and getting them planning permission. And then my mother developed Alzheimer's disease, and my father had died, and I decided that I was going to be there for my mum. So I was going to stay in Malvern. I was going to drop the travelling abroad and this, that, and the other. And although she was beyond, well, I don't know whether we could have lived with each other anyway, but she was beyond the point of that. But I used to take her out regularly, and we used to drive in Malvern Hills, which are a designated, it was an area of outstanding natural beauty. Now it's a national landscape. They're very beautiful. And I had spent quite a lot of my life trying to leave, didn't want to come back to Malvern. That was my childhood place. Every week we drive in the hills, and she'd say, "Do we live here?" And I'd say, "Yes, Mum." And she would say, "Aren't we lucky?" And we realised that I had taken this incredible place for granted. And because I'd made the decision to stay around, I was then asked to do a lot of local work, which meant getting to know my neighbourhood. And I had to walk every inch and talk to people. And that's what brought me in. So, it's not that long ago that I could not identify trees and shrubs.
And really understand historically, socio-politically, in every which way where you are. And that sort of in many ways helps you understand who you're living with, what your communities are, why are they built up in a certain way, people's reactions, all this comes into it.
This is what's so this is why I like to go back in time, probably reasonably to the end of the last ice age, which is when people were traveling more and technologies were developing. And I've discovered that in Britain, there are people alive today whose DNA is linked to the same family from 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. They're in the same spot. And when you actually look at how people settled and how they travelled and what they were doing, then you begin to understand why the landscape looks like it does because of human intervention. India is a country that I would love to visit because I imagine that there are places where human beings have not influenced that landscape.
Some places, yes.
What it is, and that's what you get. Whereas here, although nature tries really hard to recover and it works very well, everything we see here is human influence.
So Kali, you were conveniently mentioning Malvern. You're the president of the Malvern Spa Association, and you've got some interesting stories to tell, background to tell about Malvern Spas. What is all of this about, and what is it that you're looking after in many ways?
So Malvern Hills are made out of granite, which is extremely hard rock. And what happens is rainfall falls onto the top of the hills, and then it goes down through cracks and it collects. And the pressure there forces the water out, and those are springs. So we know that for thousands and thousands of years, people have been coming to the hills to collect the water. We think that the hills were considered to be so sacred to people that they didn't settle, they didn't live there. It was very much for ceremonial purposes at different times of year. And we now know that they would have blessed the springs, they would have left offerings. And so it's been a tradition that the town has had for thousands of years. Around about 1,000 years ago, springs started to get a more widespread reputation for healing. Some were said to heal eye problems, some could heal leprosy, and nobody really knew why they had these healing properties, but it was accepted. And then in the 1700s, the waters were analysed and they were discovered to contain nothing. They don't, because the rock is so hard, they don't absorb any minerals. And it's filtered through the rock, and therefore it is some of the purest water. So it's not the minerals which are healing. So the doctors came to the conclusion that actually what it was just bathing in and drinking pure water in a beautiful environment And then eating a healthy diet and taking exercise was the thing. And we had the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s, where industrial pollution affected health very badly. And so doctors sent people to places like Malvern to recover. That turned into, instead of it helping the poor who were working and who were most affected, it became very fashionable. And so Malvern grew in Victorian times for a thing called the water cure, which turned the town into what it is today. And then in the 1900s, that fell away, and Malvern pretty much went very quiet. So in 1998, well, it was in 1996 we decided that we needed to look at the springs, find out what was there, find out about its history, natural, cultural history. And from there, we set up what we called Malvern Spa Association. And our aim is to protect, enhance, and promote knowledge of, with the community, all the spring water in the hills. And so we have hundreds of volunteers. And if by any chance you or your listeners are in Malvern around May Day, all the springs and wells are dressed. And there are hundreds of them. We actually have to limit it to about 50 or 60. And every year the dressers choose a theme, which can be whatever they like, planets and stars or books or peace, whatever you like. And they're dressed to that theme, and they stay dressed for a week, and we have a water festival.
So all these little springs are dressed, is what you're saying. Oh, wow, how fascinating. So we've been to the St. Anne's Well, and would that have been a sacred spot as well?
Yes, in fact, St. Anne's Well was probably one of the first that was associated with the church, because the church sent a few monks to Malvern. There was nothing there, it was just wilderness. And they sent them to Malvern to be hermits. So they could live alone in the woodlands, and they had the spring water, so it was an obvious place for them to be. And the legend is that St. Oswald, I think it was, found well as a spring and said, this is the place where the church has to be. So St. Anne's Well became very famous from the 11th century.
Right, okay. So you talk of hermits. Was this a very common tradition, and would they go away and meditate? What would they do?
Yes, absolutely. If they were monks, they were Christian monks. And sometimes if they misbehaved, they would have to be sent to contemplate. Others just wanted to contemplate. So the males and the females would always be kept completely separate. And that continued through the water cure days. You'd have a male hotel and a female hotel.
Yes.
So it was contemplation, meditation. So we know that some of the springs were probably used. The Christian tradition of baptism, for example, was very important. So they would have immersed themselves in the spring water. And this is the tradition that we want to bring back, is for after lockdown. We had never before had people asking us, where can we bathe in Malvern water? And then lockdown was the time, I think, when people went out into their backyards because they had nowhere else to go and said, oh, this is interesting. I've never looked at this before. And they said, where can we bathe in Malvern water? Now there is nowhere public. There used to be swimming pools. I remember age 6 shivering, having to dive into cold spring water. Now I wish I could do that. And people had private ones, public ones. So we're trying to encourage people to, if they have a spring in their garden, to open it up for themselves for bathing, or even an Airbnb or bed and breakfast.
Right.
We're trying to get public immersion sites, or we would bring a bath to a spout and connect it with a hose.
Right.
And we even put a tent on top so that people can have a private immersion. Yeah. But the thing about the Malvern Spa Association is that it draws such a wide range of people, from scientists to wizards to druids to geologists to historians, all simply because of a desire to appreciate the water and protect it, which is what's incredible about it.
And are there modern studies done, and is it still therapeutic?
Well, this is a bit of a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. We're not very good at technology, and so we outsource our website and emails. And the person who does that emailed me a few months ago and said, we've had a very strange email from China. and we can't quite understand it. We don't know whether it's spam. I said, oh, send it, I'll have a look. And it started, Dear President. So I thought, well, that's fair enough. And it said, I'm a Dr. Wang from such and such a rehabilitation hospital in China. And I'm a specialist in rehabilitating stroke and Parkinson's patients using hydrotherapy. And we have hot springs. As a long story short, we managed to communicate, and now we communicate through video. And we have he asked me to present at a Chinese forum on spas, which I did online. He's contributed to our newsletter, and I've contributed to theirs. And we've concluded that we need to set up an international organization which promotes spas and water, nature, healing, and also music, because they're using therapy to help people when they're trying to recover mobility and using water. They're using music rhythm to help the patients walk. And furthermore, one of the springs where water is bottled in Malvern is called the Holy Well, and that's bottled by a Chinese company. So we're hoping that they'll come over next year and we can talk. I would love Malvern to become a hydrotherapy centre again.
Wow, how fascinating. So would all the other spa towns have granite as well? And would they be similar? So Leamington's different and Bath is different.
So Bath is hot springs and they're mineral. So they have very high mineral content. Some springs have high salt content. Now there are springs on the hills which flow through limestone. So they have slightly higher mineral content, and some people prefer, they call that one the champagne of springs. I prefer the granite one. I just prefer the quality of the water. And there is, as an aside, a woman called Veda Austin, who is from New Zealand, and she's just published a book called The Language of Water. She has been photographing water at the point of freezing, and she has been informing the water with images, and the images that she is getting are beyond extraordinary. I'm a great skeptic about a lot of things, but this is one thing that is very, very hard to deny. All her things are online, but trying to demonstrate that water does have memory and it does have consciousness and it can inform us. And then there's a chap called Victor Schauberger, who was probably in the early 19th, 20th century, who, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he said, we're using water in the wrong, or we're engineering power in the wrong way. We're turning it outwards, whereas the power of water is inwards. And I think what it was that the major companies, the commercial companies, were so invested in a certain route that they want to know about alternatives. And I feel now is the time that all of these things are coming back.
I know of a Japanese scientist who studied the crystallization of
Emoto, exactly. So Veda is kind of taking over where he left off.
Right. Yeah. How fascinating. So in line with these sort of, for example, you're working with spas. On the walk, you also mentioned you've worked with traveler communities, local communities, and historic places. How different is it? And do you have? I'm sure you have so many fascinating stories. So if you could tell us, the characteristics and what are you looking out for, and any interesting stories, really.
First of all, I have to earn a living. So I do get paid commission. I never advertise because I'm so busy. But because I work for myself, I will only take on projects that I can support. So I have to get to know a little bit about the people, the place, the project before I start. And actually, that's a landscape subject, which to me is so important that a lot of people don't understand, is the difference between character, landscape, the character of the landscape, and views of it. And you can affect the character of the landscape by putting a nuclear power station on it, regardless of whether anybody can see that. It changes that character from maybe wild to industrial. So it's really, really important to understand that. So I need to do that preliminary research, see what I think. So in the 1980s, I was working out in France, restoring wine chateaus, working with French aristocrats, on the most incredible designs. And that I thought was the summit of my career. Then in the early 2000s, I was working for an engineering company and asked to go to, first of all, to look at a project in Monaco to extend the whole city offshore.
Wow.
Go to Montenegro, which had just announced that it was an ecological state. And they wanted to build an eco resort on this most beautiful beach on the east side of the Adriatic. The firm that I was working for was very commercial, and the client was from the Middle East, and money was no object. £1 million worth of fees to spend in 4 months. I had to manage a team of 80 specialists, and we had to present to the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi at the end of all of this. But halfway through the project, I realized that the client had no intention of having an eco resort. What he said,
wow.
I want Monte Carlo plus the Eiffel Tower, a sort of tax haven with gambling and high-rise development. And so I had to deliver the client's vision, but pretend it was eco. Fortunately, we then had the financial crash, and so nothing went ahead. And that was when I started to question what I was doing with these people. Was I really wanting to be part of a contribution to something that I didn't agree with? Then I started working on my own, and the Travellers Community Project was brilliant. It was south of the M42 near the airport, and it was the council accommodate travellers, the travelling community, in certain sites so that they know where these are. They can rock up either in their vans or lorries, and some of them come with pony and cart, horse and trap. It was an enormous site that I think must have been used before. It wasn't an agricultural site, and it was a real mess. And then what they were going to do was each unit gets a small brick-built kitchen, bathroom, sitting room, space to park your vehicle, a little private garden at the back, and then there's also a pony paddock where you can turn out your horses. And they don't stay there for long. They may be there overnight or a few days. And there had to be a car park. And I thought, I think I'm going to try and make every single plant. I was to design the landscape scheme and all the planting. I thought, I'm going to make every single plant edible. I did a lot of research I tried to make them mostly native, but there are a lot of ornamentals. And then I thought, well, I wonder what traveling people would like. So I managed to get onto a travelers forum online. Long conversations about medicinal, botanical, myth, legend. And in terms of the pony paddock, the grass that was to be put down there, they specified all of the herbs which the horses would naturally go to. And one of them is called self-heal, which is what grows in people's lawns. So, and I obviously had to avoid anything poisonous. And they gave me ideas of where even the planting in the car park to separate the bays was edible, raspberries and blackcurrants. So I put all these plans to the council and to get permission for themselves to do this. And they said, oh, no, we cannot possibly in public places encourage people to eat plants in case there's anything poisonous. I looked at my plans and I said, okay, yes, I'll change all of the plans. I realized that what I'd done was I'd written all of the names of the plants in English.
Right.
So I changed the name of every single plant to Latin.
Masterstroke.
It got passed.
But it did pass.
It did pass. In fact, I must go back and see how it's developed and whether the community do use it, but I'm hoping they do.
Yes. So with people like travelers communities, they probably have so much of hidden knowledge about all of these herbs and edible plants because they haven't, of course they would have changed a bit, but...
Yes, and it goes back to what you were saying before about not being familiar with your own backyard. That what I've outside my house is just an ordinary semi-detached council house, ex-council house, but outside I've put a wooden pergola and I've covered it with a corrugated plastic with a gutter, and then I've actually put some trellis underneath that, and I've grown a grapevine underneath it. And I did that about not long after I moved in, must be 20 years ago, and there's a table and chairs under there. I sit outside. I always take whatever drink I'm having, a little pause. I sit outside, whether it's hot, snow, rain every single day, 365 days of the year. First of all, I feed the birds, so I get to know them. I observe, we interact, and I've learned, and it sounds, again, I'm a skeptic about supernatural things, if you like, but I have understood how to communicate with birds. I've understood what they're trying to tell me. Yesterday, the pigeon, fat pigeon, normally when I come out, he waddles away, but he knows I'm going to feed him. He's a bit shy. But yesterday he was sitting on the bird table and he was making a noise which I'd never heard before. And he was tilting his head. And I realized that birds can't see all around. If they're looking at the food, they use one eye to look down. If they're looking at the sky, they use one eye to look up. When I looked up in the sky, there was a buzzard wheeling right above.
Oh.
There was a buzzard. I understand when the blackbirds and robins are telling me there's a cat, there's a magpie, I'm hungry. It's just, and what they want, the blackbirds in particular and the robins who come very close, is when I open the door and go out and they're waiting for me, they like me to look them in the eye. And that means, don't worry, I've seen you. Because sometimes I can just rush out and then that worries me. They want me to say, yes, I've seen you there, I will feed you. What I also do is I have a few vegetables, things in pots, herbs growing right there, so that again, I can recognize seedlings. I can recognize the ones I want, and it's just pure observation. And I think that's why the traveling community are so close to the earth. We were talking about the weather on the walk, and the wonderful books by Tristan Gooley, who again your readers may know of, but if they don't, look him up online. Tristan Gooley.
I'll put a description underneath the video. Yeah,
they're very, very accessible and entertaining. But the first one about the weather took me a year to read because I wanted to absorb everything he was telling me so that I could use it. And I can now pretty much say what the weather's going to do 16, 18 hours ahead. You keep an eye on it. And also I noticed the plants behave differently, the animals behave differently in different weather, which he describes and explains. Birds will often go very quiet just before it's going to rain heavily. They seem to sense that the drop in pressure, something like that. Plants, a lot of plants, you'll notice clover, actually, that is very easy to recognize, and look out for four-leaf clovers. But a clover, normally, when the temperature drops or it goes slightly cloudy, they'll start to close up. So if it's going to be cloudy for a long time, you'll see all the clovers closing up. It's just little signs.
That's amazing. So conveniently, now that we are on to the topic of clovers, can we please start about talking about foraging? I know the fruit trees in my garden. I know of nettles, thanks to the allergies that I suffer. And I was introduced to wild garlic. But on the walk, you were telling us about ground elder, and you mentioned mustard. Is it wild mustard?
Yes, garlic mustard.
Yes, I have all sorts of questions. How do you start? When do you start? What do you eat? What do you do if you're zero knowledge? How do you go about it? And what are the common things that you can? What seasons?
Rule number one is never eat anything unless you are 100% sure what it is. I was showing off the other day and clipped a bit of plant and said, this is lovage, put it into my mouth. Wasn't sure about it, spat it out, looked more closely, and it was dicentra, which is moderately poisonous.
Ooh,
so,
okay.
Slap on wrist, remind lessons. So mushrooms, for example, I'm not confident with mushrooms. So what I've done is I've focused on one, which is the field mushroom, which is the most common one. And you will find that from July through to October, November in pasture, usually where sheep or cows have been grazing. And it grows out in the green, in a field. You'll spot them. They're like little UFOs in a green sky, little round ones. And those, as long as you're allowed to go and pick them, are very easy to recognize because there isn't anything else that looks much like them.
Okay.
They smell very distinctive, and if you can peel the skin off, that's definitely a field mushroom. If you touch the top of one of those mushrooms and it stains yellow, you don't touch it. So the only mushroom it can be confused with is what's called a yellow stainer, highly poisonous, but you have an immediate knowledge. Other mushrooms, there is a mushroom that I've identified called the prince, and it is one of the most delicious mushrooms that you can find. So again, I've understood families that I'm safe with. But what we did a few years ago, I think, are they called Wild Food? A group that does foraging courses, and we went on a mushroom foraging course. So for mushrooms, for any foraging, I would actually go on a course because it is such fun. We foraged the mushrooms and then they showed us how to cook them. And we ate them with bread that they'd made and with elderflower lemonade, and it was just fantastic. So rule number one is know what it is that you're eating. And if you can't afford to go on a foraging course online, there are so many resources. You've got library books, fantastic books. Identify. Second rule, unless you're after one thing, so for example, crab apples, which make crab apple jelly, that's one of my favorite things. Try not to take too much. Now, that's not only because it's food for animals and other people maybe, but also if you're foraging for green things. Now, there's a theory that here in this part of Europe, that we evolved to eat on a seasonal basis. So in the spring, we'd wake up from not exactly a long sleep, but it would have been quiet and cold. Our digestive systems would be sluggish, and therefore we would go out and eat green shoots that were coming. So there, in the spring, you're looking for nettle shoots, dandelion leaves, little green things that are edible, but because often they're very bitter, because they stimulate the digestive system, you only want small quantities, but lots of flowers are edible, and you can mix them with your own salad or lettuce. But the benefits that you're getting from that are huge. Then in the summer, we would have come down from the mountain and we would have gone to water, either river or sea. So we would have been eating seafood, seaweeds, and then we would have started getting the wild fruits. You'd have started.
Right, because we were moving communities, we weren't settling.
Exactly. There is a theory that we started farming and then gave it up because it was too much trouble. Collecting stuff and processing it wasn't the ideal thing, and that farming came much later and was reimposed on hunter-gatherer communities, that foraging was actually a much nicer life. So then in the summer, you're eating all of that. And then in the autumn, you'd be walking back up the mountain, you'd be eating the berries, the fruits, mushrooms, but you would also be hunting game. And then in the winter, you'd retreat to your cave and you would store your meat. You'd need to store and eat your meat. You might have roots. And then off you go again. So that concept of foraging in this part of the world appeals to me, or this climate appeals to me, because I think my body may be telling me that spring is coming, I need to eat these things. Summer, it's also understanding what is going to be ripe when. And it's the joy of once you've collected something and thinking, what am I going to do with this? So hazelnuts, for example, if you can get them before the dormice do, you get this bag of hazelnuts and then you think, crikey, so you crack them and then you roast them and then you have to get the skins off. But and then you eat one, you might only get 2 or 3 out of a big bag even. But the joy of those 3 that you collected and you sorted out and you ate is I think what takes people foraging. So it's start with something that you're familiar with, do something with it, eat it, and then you might say, oh, well, maybe I could add something else. It's a slow journey, but there's a lot of communities. Oh, another rule is don't collect near roadsides or where there may be pollution. People say that churchyards are actually an excellent place to forage because they're very clean. But do check, roadsides aren't great, or you wash things very carefully. But flowers, if you grow an elder tree or you know where elder trees are, you've got the flowers in the spring, which are wonderful just even for scenting puddings or making syrup. Again, this was the start of my foraging journey, I think. Many years ago, I read that elderberry syrup was possibly one of the best things that you could take to boost the immune system, particularly in the autumn. And it's full of antioxidants. Purple things are full of antioxidants, whatever they are. I'm not good at the scientific bit.
Yes.
I went to the chemist and said they have it. And they said they could get it in for me. This was a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. They could order it in and it would be £14 for a small bottle. So that was a lot of money in those. I said, okay, I'm going to try this. Came from Israel. Then it said you have 2 teaspoons a day. And I thought,
they'll be gone in 3 days.
I will make my own. So I did. And it was so easy to make and so satisfying that I started, and I'd maybe add a little spice, a little bit of star anise, a little bit of this. Then I discovered Oxymel, Oxymel. And Oxymel is broadly a 50-50 mixture of oxy being vinegar and mel being honey. And again, you mix those together, you start taking that often in the autumn to boost your immune system. Well, I had colds after lockdown almost constantly, even in the summer. I was not my usual self. So I started making and taking Oxymel. Maybe as you can tell, I'm feeling absolutely great.
Wow.
And add to it what you want. I added turmeric. I made a turmeric Oxymel. You make one which is called Fireside, where you put chili, garlic, onion.
Yeah.
You spice it up or take it down, make it as sweet or as sour as you like. But the health benefits of that, again, this is knowledge which we've lost. This is just old, and people, I think because of social media and the internet, that the sharing, but also I'm feeling that communities want to help each other now. You know, if you want to go foraging, you're going to find a foraging group somewhere who will love to tell you, they'll, like me, tell you everything about what you can and can't eat.
Yeah. Fascinating. Just the seasonality of it. And of course, your bodies you're part of nature. So of course, your bodies want a certain thing in spring and autumn. It's natural that in summers you'll have berries because they're there. You won't have those berries in winter. Such a fascinating subject.
Well, it is. And I think I apply that to all of my food now, is that I will only eat what's in season. And I plan my whole year around what I'm growing. There's a wonderful book, you might put the link to this, by a woman called Barbara Kingsolver, which is called The Animal Vegetable Miracle.
Right.
And it's a true story. She and her family had some land in the north of America, and they decided to try and live for a year pretty much off-grid, trying to be self-sustainable. It was a slight joke in that, you know, were they going to give up coffee and wine? The kids were teenagers. Began to realize that when you're faced with a glut of something like beans, you want to eat them and eat them and eat them and get completely fed up with them and never see them again. I don't even enjoy freezing excess produce because in the winter I just don't want those frozen beans. The only things I will store are things like, there's a dish called ratatouille, which is made from tomatoes, aubergines. You know, if I've got gluts, I can put everything into one, and then I've got something for the winter. But that's more of the concept of a stew, more comfort food, if you like.
Yes.
The only things that I find very, very difficult to give up are the tomatoes and cucumbers. I won't buy them if they're flown in, but I miss them.
Going back to foraging and how you said churchyards are one of the cleanest places. On the walk, you also mentioned that before the churches were established, these used to be sacred sites. So they've been sort of pure and clean places for a long time. So if we could pause there a bit and if you could explain.
Yeah, this is absolutely fascinating. So many British churchyards will have a yew tree in them, which is an evergreen. And probably 5,000-6,000 years ago, at least, people held that tree sacred. In fact, they held a lot of evergreen trees sacred because in our cold, dark winters, have a tree that you could bring inside, you'd have the light and the greenery. And that's still very much the part of the British traditional Christmas. So the yew trees would often have occurred naturally. If they happened to occur near a spring, springs were always shelter and fresh water, two absolutely wonderful attributes to have. Plus, if it was a sacred tree and a sacred spring, it was even better. The first people from the outside, I suppose, of the British Isles to arrive were the Romans, who arrived about 2,000 years ago. And they encountered the communities that were here. There was a fair amount of conquering going on for commercial purposes, but it wasn't as bad, I think, as historians have thought, in that there was integration. And so the Romans and we had a fairly, what we would call a pagan, we didn't have Christianity. They had gods and goddesses. So everybody was able to say, oh, yes, well, we've got a water goddess, or we've got an earth. There was a lot of commonality. Again, the water drew people together. So the Romans would maybe build a temple on that site, or they would share where the spring was, where the tree was. Right. Often there would be within a forest or within a wood, people would create a clearing, or there would be a natural clearing, often where there was water, and that would be called a grove. And again, like a modern day church or temple that you would go for meditation, contemplation, or to meet, to discuss. So the groves became very important. Now, when the Christians arrived, they weren't terribly happy about anything that didn't appear to comply with Christianity.
Right.
Again, there was integration and agreement about what was important and what was valuable in the landscape. So the churches would then often be built on top of the Roman site, the Bronze Age site. So many churches are built, or certainly the older ones are built on what we believe are much older sites. And I think the oldest yew tree in Britain has been dated back to 5,000 years. I think it's in Wales. Yeah. So they are very ancient, and very much revered.
But isn't some part of the yew tree poisonous?
Yes. A lot of the yew tree is poisonous. I think I told you it was in the churchyard that.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Not something to try at home unless you really know what you're doing and want to impress people, that it is the seed which is poisonous, of the red berry, but the flesh of the berry is not. As children, we are always taught you do not touch, and it's also very poisonous to animals as well.
Right.
And that people often thought that they were planted in a churchyard because the churchyard was walled so that the cattle wouldn't eat them. But we know now that's not the case. So yes, we were taught not to eat any part of a yew tree just in case. But in fact, again, if you do your homework, you will find. And I think people make yewberry jam actually. But if you find a seed in it, just be very careful.
Right. If other than the flesh of the berry, most of it is poison, why would it be a sacred tree?
It's more for it being evergreen. And also they're very beautiful. They spread as they grow, they spread outwards, and so they can become hollow inside. There's one not far from here. So again, a meeting place.
Yes.
A place.
So similar to yew trees, what other trees would have been? I mean, I just know of the oak or the birch, or these 2 or 3. What other trees would have been there so many thousands of years ago? What were the indigenous?
Well, that's also very interesting, because imagine back to the Ice Age, about 11.5 years ago, then the ice was retreating and it was getting warmer. And so sea levels were rising. And at one time, the sea levels were low enough that the British Isles were connected to Europe, to mainland Europe. You just walked across. But because it was very, very cold after the Ice Age, we had more of a tundra landscape where nothing was growing. And so as time went by, people were traveling and introducing things like oak, because acorns would have been eaten. Crab apples were coming, but also things were being blown in on the wind. The aspen and the birch and the pine, they're called pioneering species. Those are the ones, even if you've had a fire somewhere, those are going to be the ones that come in first. They blow in on the wind, they establish quickly, they don't need fertile soil, they put some roots down, and then their leaves fall, and that starts to create soil. So that means then that other plants can come in. And obviously you've got animals which will be eating berries, carrying the seeds in their stomachs, excreting them. So you've got little packages of fertilizer. So that's gradually how it spreads. So we know that the oak, then the ash came in. The Romans introduced horse chestnut, sycamore, a lot of our familiar trees that we think of forever were introduced by the Romans.
Okay.
And impressed with our fruit at all, because we only had crab apples, hawthorns, and I don't know if you've ever had a sloe or what do they call blackthorn fruit, which are tiny, tiny little, they're miniature plums.
They're like gauges, are they? They're not the gauges.
It's the same family.
Okay.
But these grow wild all over Britain, and they're tiny. If one way you bite into it, you feel like your whole mouth has gone dry. People use them to make damson gin. It's like damsons. They make gin out of it. So our fruit, we had crab apples. It was all bitter. So the Romans brought sweet apples, sweet chestnuts, sweet grapes. They like their sugar.
Pear trees?
Well, no, I think they brought the sweet pear, but we do have a wild pear.
Okay.
It's very rare. I don't see very many around here. If you find one of those, you're very lucky. I make, it's the jellies that I like the pear jelly out of. So then holly came in, and again, a lot of the evergreens that came in, we had box and holly were revered because they were evergreen. It was the Druids.
Yes.
Who were around before the Romans, and they worship mistletoe. And mistletoe is a parasitic plant that will grow on another tree. And again, I think because it was fruiting, we often see mistletoe at Christmas and we're supposed to kiss under it for good luck.
Yes.
That again, because it was fruiting at that time of year in the winter, it was sacred. And each plant had each tree had its own quality, its own spirit. It was dedicated to different qualities such as strength or wisdom. And again, as we discovered on the walk, what we're rediscovering is the medicinal benefits of plants. In that, the story I told is that the folklore is that if you want a good sleep, you sleep under a weeping willow tree. Then I realized that it's the bark of the willow, it's similar to, or it's an ingredient in aspirin. And the number of plants, which I now realized are used to create synthetic drugs, the unsynthetic use of those plants is quite extraordinary. And they've now discovered that that plants can heal each other. So willow, again, apparently if you have a plant which is sick, certain plants, you would put willow branches on it and it can help to heal that plant.
Oh, wow. So there's so much of research about how there's so much communication between trees. So an old oak, or if there's a disease, then the oak can actually pass messages through this mycelium network to another oak. But it's not just that, it's also interspecies is what you're sort of,
Yes. And it's the fungi that are...
That's the network, isn't it?
That's the network. And some of these mushroom bodies apparently appear to be dictating what grows where. They're almost cultivating their own tree species to benefit themselves. But to me, the idea of a tree and what it will do is let's say it's on the front line and it's putting out its roots. And if that root gets to something nasty, like, I don't know, a cliff edge or something polluted, it's going to send a message back saying, guys, don't come any further.
That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, they're just not speaking our language, but there's definitely some communication there.
Exactly.
And very intelligent communication.
I suppose because it's just quite slow. It probably takes quite a while. I don't know. But we are beginning to understand it. And there's a wonderful phenomenon where trees, I think, of the same species, when they're growing in a forest, if you look up, there's a phenomenon called canopy shyness, where they'll very politely not touch. So you see little rivers of light between the canopies through the sky. Amazing.
There's logic to it so that they each get light, isn't it?
Yes.
The more we understand, the more, it's just fascinating. Animals and plants and trees are communicating, but just that we don't understand it. And also, what also is fascinating, it's not survival of the fittest. It's in fact helping each other to become the fittest or whatever they are.
Well, there is another theory about this, that that there is an interest in human beings helping each other, because that makes a better society for our own offspring. So there's a kind of a selfish...
There is a selfish sort of reason, but yeah.
Generous.
There's another huge topic that I wished to cover, and you said, "Oh, I can do a whole hour about it." In the 1980s, you came up, or you promoted this idea of ECA.
Environmental colour assessment.
Before we started chatting, you said to me, it's a theory and it can be applied anywhere, but I'll let you do the talking. What is it? What is it in general, and why can that be applied to landscape, and what was your contribution, etc.?
Okay. So ECA is environmental colour assessment. And it's the concept of colour in its own right, as a subject on its own. And in France, around about 150 years ago, both artists and scientists started to analyse colour. What is this? How does it behave? What happens? How do you use it? Now, everybody, I think, will sympathise with going to work one day and having a red shirt or a red tie and thinking, what colour is going to go with that? Worse, you know the colour of the carpet in your sitting room and you need curtains to match, but without actually taking a sample of that colour, and you think, I know that colour in my head, and you bring the curtain material home, you're way out. This then becomes a problem in planning and architecture. Architects go, well, yellow, blue, I know, green. Green would be great because green landscape. So the French said, no, we actually need to understand how colour behaves. And the most important thing in terms of colour is that it's never seen on its own. It's always seen in combination with other colours. So it's not about the colour on its own. It's about how it behaves with another colour. So there's a wonderful, it's called the colour wheel, which I'm sure people will be familiar with. And the system that we use, it's got what we call the mother colour. So the very brightest of all reds, the very brightest of all greens and blues. Where colour becomes interesting is what happens when you put those two colours together. Now, opposite colours on that wheel will normally fight with each other. So if you have an equal amount of red and an equal amount of green and you put those together, that's going to confuse your brain. You almost won't be able to look at it.
There's no harmony at all.
No, but if you put a large amount of that red and a very small amount of that green, they'll work with each other. Then once you know the mother colour, you can start adding certain amounts of either black or white to those colours. From that mother red, if you add black or white, that whole family of colours will always go back to the mother colours. So there, I've got a red shirt. So if I found something that was the same mother colour but paler or darker, that would go. If I found the opposite colour and added a little bit of green to my outfit, that would work. Same with carpets. So outside, we have to first of all look at the context. In other words, are you going to, let's say somebody wants to put up a big new building. Let's say you're going to see that from a number of places. Are you going to see that building against the sky? How do you see the colour of sky when it changes every 5 minutes? We have blue sky, black sky, clouds. So whereas if it's seen against a landscape, could we hide it? Do we want to hide it is the first question.
Right.
Yes, you can. You can camouflage it completely. Or you might say, well, we don't necessarily want to hide it, but we want it to fit in. That's fine. We can work with these colours. Or you're going to get the corporates who say, well, yes, I'm happy with all green, but I want my corporate logo to stand out.
Yes.
A firm like McDonald's, who are very precious about McDonald's yellow, they did agree to, within a historic conservation area, just to tone down that yellow a little bit. It still was McDonald's yellow, but it wasn't quite so yellow. So now it's being asked for as a process in planning, so that a developer will have to do an environmental colour assessment, say these are the colours that I'm going to select, this is how they're going to work, is that okay? And then we can say yes or no.
Is that where, for example, when you go to the Cotswolds, all the buildings are in the Cotswold, is what color? Yellow, no,
It's
right.
very much so. So again, it's understanding what is the local geology. What, if you're going to construct buildings, you're obviously going to want to use the local materials. So traditionally, all of the houses would have been built out of that very unusually beautiful golden honey yellow stone. A lot of people have understood that for their windows, their gardens, to go with that, there is a very particular turquoisey blue, which is very common in the Cotswolds. Whether people have done it scientifically or not, I think their eyes understand that those colours work very comfortably together, so it's very popular. Whereas you go to areas of Herefordshire where you've got bright red sandstone, so again, it's different colours that will work better with that. What I would say, though, is that in nature, or mostly, rock isn't often exposed, so it can be quite a shock to see these very coloured stone buildings. First time I ever worked on a chalk landscape, and I saw somebody had scraped a big hole in the ground with a machine, and I just forgot that chalk is white.
Yes.
White, beautifully white. And, ancient people carved animals and people out of the landscape. Yes. But it was a shock for what was underneath my feet to be revealed. Also in the assessments, we look at cultural aspects as well. So we did a colour study in Birmingham. There's a place called Longbridge where to build they're called an Austin car, which were very, very popular in the 1940s and 50s. And my parents had one. I remember it very well. Anyway, they closed the factory and they wanted to build commercial premises and houses. So we said, right, let's do a colour assessment for the new development, but let's see what colours are there now. And we like to collect memory colours. So around the factory, we saw this turquoise blue paint, windows and doors. So we picked it up in the colour study. We use a reference for it. And then somebody from the old factory explained that it was the old Austin A40 blue, and they had all these cans of paint lying around. So they painted all the doors with it. So that became a colour in the new development colour that the older people could remember that. And that was very
right.
In the devastation of their lives.
Yes.
Something so small that connected them back.
Yes. Is that why those bricks are turquoise blue in those buildings?
Yes. It's very difficult to know where to begin with colour, but in France, they realised that there's a city called Lyon, Lyon, and it had fallen down economically. They did the colour study, repainted all of the buildings, and all of a sudden more people came because it was looking more beautiful, it felt better. Which again went on to use colour in hospitals, because people were reporting very negative experiences. Say, for example, you have to go into these, where you have a radiography, they're concrete bunkers. And the patients in this French hospital were saying, we're having a bad enough experience. Why can't you make this more pleasant? So they called French colour consultants who worked with the patients and put some of their work on the way in, and they colour coded the cubicles, and they said that the patients were coming saying, I really feel like having the blue cubicle today. It's a blue day for me. They've discovered that colour, psychological effects of colour are that you can use colour to control behaviour or influence behaviour. So in prisons, there's one colour, I can't remember what it is. I have a feeling it's a kind of pink, which is very calming. People who are in a bit of a spate, you put them in that room, it calms them down. Again, it can be used in schools to stimulate. They used it in companies like French Aerospace, working with the employees, and it actually increased productivity because people were happier in their environment. So the uses of colour are, again, widespread.
Yeah. So is there, you've worked in so many countries and with different cultures. Is there a lot that you have to keep in mind when you're designing, of course, culturally? And how different is it? I'm sure it's so different, isn't it, with every beliefs and culture and everything?
As I started to learn that was what I tried to bring. I wanted to go and find out not what was there, but what people were showing me was there, and what was important to them and why. And it's not just about the physical things, it's about the qualities of the place, the sense, history of wildlife, of ancestors, of spirits, of everything that you can think of. So it is incredibly sensitive. But again, I would rather help those communities learn how to shape their own futures and make those decisions, rather than me making the decisions for them. Or at least my decisions or government decisions are informed by not only the people who were there in the past, but people who've got to live there in future. And again, coming back to colour, Indigenous use of colour is incredibly important. And often that comes from what's available from the land or the plants, soils.
And I suppose climate and
Absolutely.
because all the sort of course, because I'm familiar with the two cultures, English and Indian, all the Indian colors tend to be very, very bright red, maroons, yellows, oranges, whereas here it was all very blues and navy blues and greys, and
Well, now that is a very interesting point, because I agree with you that we are quite a grey country. But what they have discovered is that, especially in churches, that underneath all the dirt and pollution, that the brightness of the colours that were used on walls and frescoes and floors were quite incredible. And I think perhaps it's our Victorian ancestors who were a bit more, it's all got to be grey.
Yes, like we were just saying, Carly, it's been almost an hour and a half chatting, and I think we've covered all sorts of subjects. Is there anything that you'd like to say
Don't get me started. No, actually, I found that the way that you wove all of those subjects together so they flowed like water was wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you that you can just talk about any subject, which is amazing. So thank you so much for doing this. I'm hoping everybody will enjoy it, and it's very enriching.
Well, I hope it's the start of a journey, and if anybody would like to become a landscape architect, let me know.
Yes. Hopefully you'll fascinate a career as well. Inspire a career, I should say. So
thank you, Sujata. That was very enjoyable.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Bye.
Bye.